Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Jenna Weiss. I'm the Associate Director of Public Programs at the Jewish Museum. Thank you for coming on this rainy Thursday uptown. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation of the season. And we are also marking 10 years of this incredible partnership between the Jewish Museum and Jewish Book Council and Tablet Magazine. So thank you for being here. Tonight's talk, Wandering Jews, Two Diasporic Journeys Out of the Ottoman Empire, features authors Elizabeth Graver and Jordan Salama in conversation with series moderator Stephanie Butnick. This event is co-presented with the Jewish Book Council and Tablet Magazine, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank collaborators at both organizations for their work on this event. We hope you'll join us for the rest of the season's conversations, both virtually and on-site here at the Jewish Museum. Our next talk, entitled Always the Other, The Continued Rise of Anti-Semitism from Dreyfus to Today, featuring Rabbi Diana Fursko and author Maurice Samuels, will be held here on Thursday, April 18th at 7 p.m. And finally, on Thursday, May 16th, we'll host a virtual panel with Rabbis Sharon Brous and Shai Held. For details about all of our upcoming public programs, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. And now I would like to welcome Miri Pomerantz-Dauber, Associate Director of Jewish Book Council, who will tell you a little bit more about tonight's program.
Thank you, Jenna. As always, I'm so pleased to be able to welcome you on behalf of Jewish Book Council. We're thrilled to present Unpacking the Book for its 10th year in partnership with Jewish Museum and Tablet Magazine. Each program we've offered in the series brings together authors who approach similar subject matter through their own unique lens. Tonight, we will be exploring displacement, endurance, and family as home, while armchair traveling through Istanbul, Barcelona, Havana, the Jewish Levant, South America, and the Argentine Andes, looking at Mizrachi and Sephardic diasporic journeys with authors Elizabeth Graver and Jordan Salama, who each explore their subject in their recently published books, Kantika and Stranger in the Desert, respectively. They will be joined by our always wonderful moderator, Stephanie Butnick. Tonight's conversation is a meaningful addition to our work at the Jewish Book Council of educating, enriching, and strengthening the community through Jewish literature. To learn more about all of our efforts, to find reviews, essays, and book club resources, to learn about author tours, our literary journal Paper Brigade, and our literary awards, including the National Jewish Book Awards, and a special shout out to Elizabeth, who just took home our Sephardic Culture Award for Kantika this past Tuesday. I hope you will visit our website and come find a JBC staffer at the end of the program to learn more and even become a member. Before I pass things over to Stephanie, I'd like to very quickly thank the Jewish Museum, and specifically Jenna Weiss, and our media sponsor, Tablet Magazine. A very special thank you as well to Evie Sapphire Bernstein, Jewish Book Council's program director, for managing all of the ins and outs of this program, and to JBC's CEO, Naomi Firestone-Teeter. And I'm especially grateful to JBC's board of directors for their continued support of Jewish literature, ideas, and conversation. Finally, you will have the opportunity to purchase both of our books, both authors' panelist books tonight, and get them signed following the program. Not only will they both be perfect additions to your own library, they make great gifts. And now, I'd like to introduce Stephanie. Stephanie Butnick is the host of the wildly popular Jewish podcast Unorthodox, produced by Tablet Magazine, where she has worked for more than a decade in various writing and editing roles. She is the co-author of the newest Jewish encyclopedia, From Abraham to Zabars and Everything in Between, and she helped edit Tablet's first book, The 100 Most Jewish Foods, a highly debatable list. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Post. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and please enjoy the conversation.
Hi. I can't believe we've been doing this series for 10 years. I think I've been hosting for maybe 7 of them, which I hadn't realized till tonight. But this is, I have to say, one of my favorite things to do. And it's always such a privilege to be here at the Jewish Museum with the Jewish Book Council, and I'm grateful to Jenna, Naomi, Miri, everyone at both organizations for having me back year after year. And this is, I think, a very auspicious start to this latest season. And I'm gonna read your biographies, if you don't mind, so everyone knows who you are and what you're doing. So, Elizabeth Graver, your fifth novel, Cantico, was selected as a New York Times Best Historical Fiction Book of 2023, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and an NPR Best Book of 2023. And as we celebrated earlier this week, a National Jewish Book Award winner for Sephardic culture. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
And Jordan Salama is the author of Stranger in the Desert, A Family Story. His first book, Every Day the River Changes, was a Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year. His work has appeared in National Geographic, The New York Times, Smithsonian, Scientific American, and on NPR's All Things Considered. Welcome, Jordan.
Thank you.
I think it's important to note that both of these amazing books are on sale right over there. And right after this ends, you can buy them, and they will be sitting right here, and they will write anything in these books for you. They will sign them, they will inscribe them. And you can also get the latest issue of the Jewish Book Council's literary journal, Paper Brigade, which features both of these authors, and they will sign that too. They will sign anything. Whatever you want, they will sign. That's subtle, right? Like we're here to celebrate these amazing books and these wonderful authors. And I think the way I want to get started is by asking you like a very loaded question, which is, where are you from?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Who should start?
Whoever is bravest.
I think you should start.
You want me to
Yeah, that way I can copy your answer.
I mean, I love that question, and that's actually, there's a whole paragraph in my novel where Rebecca, who's the heroine of my novel, inspired by my grandmother, asks that question and has a much more complicated answer in the most literal way than I do, because she lived so many places. I have had an extraordinarily stable life. I was born in California, and they were waiting for me to be born so that they could move to Williamstown, Massachusetts, where my father was teaching, and I spent my whole childhood there. So I'm from New England, but of course we're all from so many places, and it's been one of the fascinating journeys of this book and other portions of my life too, to think about that in a more complicated way. So in terms of my kind of grandparents, one set is Ashkenazi, and they were from, you know, everyone always says Russia, Poland, like that. One side was from Russia, Poland, and the other side was from Austria-Hungary. And then the other side we're gonna talk about more, but my grandmother always really puzzled me in terms of where she was from, because she was Jewish, but she spoke all these languages and was very different from the other grandmother. So I'm from there too, right? I think we're all from the many layers that come before us. And also from New York, even though I've never lived here, because my whole family came here, you know, both sides.
I have a very similar answer, which is that I was born and raised in the New York City suburbs, but my family comes from lots of different places. My mother was born in Baghdad, Iraq, and was one of the last Iraqi Jewish families to leave in the 1970s. My father, who was born in Brooklyn, to an Argentine Syrian Jewish family, which is the family that's most prominent in this book. So they made it to Buenos Aires by way of Damascus and Aleppo, and then they came to the United States. So when I was growing up, I heard a kind of spellbinding mix of languages, even though English was the only language that was spoken to me. So bits of Spanish, Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic, bits of Hebrew and French, kind of all thrown about the dinner tables. And I feel like the last few years has kind of been a wild race to reclaim and learn some of those languages too. And one thing I want to mention is that there's a book going around, because I want to ask you the same question. At all the different cities that I've been going to talk about Stranger in the Desert, I have this guest book. And Dora's going to start passing it around here, but the idea is that you might want to sign it and inscribe your name in the guest book, but also write where your family comes from. And it's super interesting if you flip through the pages to see where other people, how they answer that question. Some people will just say, I'm from California, but then some people will say like the village of their great-grandparents. And so feel free to answer it as you wish, but I'd love to hear where you're from so that maybe I can connect some of you with people who are also from the same places.
Wow, and as you'll see when we get into Jordan's book, when he sets out to do something, he really does it. So he will be connecting all of you. I have no doubt about that. And the other thing that's going around is there are note cards on all of your seats. You've done this before. You've been to book events. You can write a question. Pencils will be going around later on. We're going to collect them, and towards the end of the program, we will ask. If I like your question, I will ask it. So make them good and probing, not just softballs, but we'll get to those as well. That's before you guys buy the book and then they sign it. Did I do that right? That was good? Okay. So this is I think a nice way to set everything up, but I do want to go back to the beginning, quite literally, and I would love for both of you to read just like a very little bit from the starts of both of your books, because as I said, I swore I read past them, but they are very, very good openings to each of your book that really, I think, sets the scene for us. So Jordan, let's start with you.
Okay. Hold on one second.
Take us to the Andes in 1920s.
Okay, so this is the Andes, 1920s. Horses sneered and mules whimpered as they faced the cold dawn of a new day's work. Gauchos stirred in their posts, tin kettles put to fire, and gourds of hot mate passed around warm embers, the sound of last night's solitary guitar still echoing about the foothills and the canyons. Among the gauchos and scattered throughout the ranches that skirted even the farthest reaching roads were a curious bunch of men who seemed, at first glance, very out of place. They spoke a foreign tongue. It wasn't Spanish, the language of the gauchos, who were also relative newcomers, displaced from their beloved pampas. Nor was it Aymara or Quechua, Diaguita or Huarpe, or any one of the other languages of the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for centuries but now found themselves increasingly attacked, conquered, and subjugated. No, these curious men spoke Arabic, the language of Mesopotamia and the cradle of civilization, the language of the beginning of the world. Many of them had strange eating habits, like abstaining from any meat that they didn't already carry with them, salted and cured. Some of them did not travel on Saturdays, their day of rest. Others wrapped black cords around their arms, rocking back and forth as they rose from bed, and in this way they prayed. These men were different from most of the gauchos and the miners and the farmhands and the herders, yes, but with them they exchanged customs of the land that they now shared, the mate and the card games and the folk songs, and the lands they only recently left behind. It is said in the Andes that these people first came with the railroads, that their houses were near the train terminals in the cities where their wives and children lived, but their homes were on the road. And much like the famous traders of the old Silk Road, from whom they were descended, they brought everything with them as they traveled from town to town, carrying their goods for sale in little sacks over their shoulders or in mule and horse-drawn carts that clacked across the dirt trails and blistering sands. Somehow, these foreign traders made it everywhere, to what seemed like the farthest reaches of civilization, up dry, wintry mountain passes and through river valleys that swelled with rain in the bountiful summers. They sold to anyone willing to give them something in return. The ranching families paid with silver, the lonely gauchos with coins, the farmers and the pickers with food, the wool sellers with ponchos, and the indigenous people with ceramics from their adobe houses. In the chilly winters, the stars were brilliant and numerous, though the sky looked different here in the southern Andes than it did in the northern countries where they came from. The moon here looked like it had been turned upside down. But with time, they would become used to the southern sky in Argentina, just as their descendants would come to think nothing of it. Just as they and their children would eventually become Argentine, and just as their parents and grandparents had become Arabs before them, hundreds of years ago in another life. In this new world, by the rivers and the valleys and the stars that guided them, the trading people found their way.
Yeah, let's clap for that. It's a good book. Elizabeth, your turn. Read to us. This is just story hour. It's perfect.
That was so gorgeous. I really loved your book. It was fun to hear you reading. I loved reading it too. Okay, so mine begins in Constantinople in 1907. So Istanbul, which was called Constantinople.
Like the song.
There you go. Excuse me. This, the beautiful time, the time of wingspans, leaps, and open doors, of the heedless headlong flow from here to there. This, the time before thought, the world arriving not as lists or hearkening back or future tense, but as breath-filled music, cantar, sing. Rebecca sings to the rhythm of the oars as the boat delivers her to school, and in school with the nuns, tournez vos yeux vers Jésus, And climbing ropes at Maccabee gymnastics, hand over hand, and wrap your feet, girls. But what draws her up is less the instructor barking commands or the strength of her limbs than the unspooling thread of her own voice. In wordless tunes, nonsense sounds, ballads in Ladino, French, bits of Turkish, Hebrew, Greek, she sings. As on the street, the lemon man sings lemons, the Bulgarian sings pudding, the vegetable man sings eggplant, squash, and artichokes. Fresh, cheap ladies, how I wait for you with my aubergine. She sings at school in chorus and for daily hymns, and at night, her mother sings the children to sleep. Dorme, dorme, querido hijico. Sleep, sleep, darling boy, though two of them are girls. And if the dull-eyed nightingale rarely makes a chirp, still her father stops by its cage most mornings to try to coax it into song. And he sings at synagogue, "You have given me a throat that has not gone dry for calling out to you." And one strange morning after services, he leads Rebecca to the ark, and she sings to the men below and the women above, her voice as unwavering as the cushioned freedoms and unspeakable good fortune of her childhood. Still, her grandmother sews a bonjuk bead to the underside of every collar to ward off the evil eye. Their house has 3 stories and is made of stone, which does not burn. Down the slope is Balat, where the poor Jews live, but her family lives at the top of the hill in Fener. Their neighbors, Greek diplomats, Armenian doctors, Jewish bankers, and traders like her father. And it is with the daughters of these families and a few equally prosperous Muslim girls that Rebecca and her sister Corinne go to Catholic school. From their bedroom window, they can see the brick tower of the Greek school for boys, and below it, the minaret of mosques, and beyond it, the Golden Horn with its blinking lighthouse, and Haskoy and Galata on the other side. Downstairs, a stream of people come and go, the door more invitation than barrier, men arriving in the evening to join Rebecca's father in prayer, and it is only after the guests kiss the mezuzah and file out into the dark that he locks the door and shuts the iron gate. Saturday wakes to sound and light. Later in life, Rebecca will encounter Jews for whom the Sabbath is a solemn davening affair. No apricots and syrup or pomegranates with their bloody pearls, just gefilte fish trembling in slime. Here, too, the meals are prepared ahead of time, and Gatil, the Armenian maid, arrives to start the fire, serve, and wash dishes, but the children are encouraged to dance and make merry on Shabbat, and in the afternoon, the family visits with relatives or takes a riverboat to the park where the babies nap in a hammock tied to a tree, sometimes several babies to one tree, suspended like pendulous damp fruit. For supper, there's cold fish and lemon and egg and lokum for dessert and toasted melon seeds to snack on, and the ball comes out for catch, the tambourine for song. Later, at home, they will light the braided candle, then snuff it with wine and laugh out loud to show the evil spirits that though Shabbat is over, joy remains and has no place for them. Ha ha ha, ha ha ha. Quien no rizika, no rozika. Whoever doesn't laugh, doesn't bloom.
Nice, yes. Thank you both. Those are 2 really, really beautiful passages. I want to get started with this idea of home, what home is. Elizabeth, your book features a striking epigraph. It's a Ladino proverb that translates to, "Let me enter and I'll make a place for myself." And Jordan, you share a line from your abuelo, who is the one who sets you off onto this journey to trace your family's steps through South America. And he says, "You'll be fine so long as you remember one thing and one thing only. Feeling like you don't fully belong anywhere probably means that you belong a little bit everywhere." So I want to ask you both about how this notion of home plays into your reasons for writing these books, which are both, while a novel and a work of nonfiction, are sort of really steeped in these same really powerful ideas of belonging and place and home.
Sure. I mean, I think that, and to the quote from Abuelo here, for me, it's always been this question. Being a big mix of things, it's hard to fit in just one category and feel like I feel purely at home in one place or in one community. It's so much easier, and I think especially in the United States for so many of us, to feel apart, to feel not at home in certain spaces, and feel like you're kind of existing in the middle somewhere. So it's been a long process for me to figure out where I most feel at home. But that's what writing has done for me. For me, home is where the stories sound familiar. So walking into, let's say, a Syrian Christian family's home in the foothills of the Andes and finding food that my grandparents had made for me in Peekskill, New York, my entire life, that's home, right? Connecting with somebody who still lives in Baghdad today and hearing similar words to the lullabies that my other grandmother used to sing to us when we were little kids, that's home. There's all of these little marks of existence, why we are the way that we are because of the people who came before us, that to me represent home. And for me, it just happens to be stories. I think because I come from a family of storytellers that have kind of traveled across the world from Sephardic Spain to Ottoman Syria to Argentina and beyond, picking up bits of home and leaving other bits of home behind as they moved.
I would echo with a lot of that, resonate with a lot of that. I mean, I think for me in writing this book, so my book is a novel, but it's a very closely hews to my grandmother's migration story. And she began, as you saw, in Turkey, and then she moved in a very weird thing for Jews of that period, and kind of atypical. They moved, quote, back to Spain, right? They were Sephardic Jews, and they moved to Spain in the 1920s. And then she came to the US by way of Cuba, and as you saw, she went to French Catholic school. So I was really struck both in imagining her story. I guess it really layered my ideas of home, but what does it mean to have to leave so much behind? There's an enormous amount of sorrow, an enormous amount of not being able to bring both things. Gardening, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, everybody was a gardener. What does it mean to leave the land? What does it mean to leave the places? And then, increasingly, for my family, what does it mean to leave people? So let me in and I'll make a place for myself. As we all know, there simply things like immigration rules, like what does it mean if your children can't cross the border? What does it mean if you can't get into a country? What does it mean, in my grandmother's case, if you need to have an arranged marriage to get into the US by way of Cuba? So there were all kinds of sorrows in the things that were left behind, but what was equally apparent to me as I wrote the book, and yet more of a surprise, I think, as I discovered the story, and I think I see some of this in your book too, what were the sort of gifts of diaspora that my grandmother had? She was multilingual. She was incredibly open. She had friends, and when I knew her in her retirement in Florida and in Queens before that, who were priests, who were Cubans, who were Ashkenazi Jews, who were Sephardic Jews. And in terms of kind of how you bring home with you, I agree with you. It's the stories, it's the songs. For my grandmother, it was the cooking, and she also, astonishingly, for someone who moved so much, saved photographs. I have photos in my book. Saved locks of her baby's hair. Saved the embroidery that she made as part of her trousseau when she, before she got married. So these things seemed extraordinarily precious, and I think she was an incredibly tactile person for whom the material world and the things that you could hold on to were really important, and she was forced by her circumstances. Her family lost all their money to lose so much, but so I think home is also in that lock. I have the lock of my uncle's. He passed away right before my book came out, but I have a lock of his hair from when he was a baby, and she was separated from him for quite a while because of migration problems.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many details in what you just said in your book, and kind of a kaleidoscopic mix of languages and places and things. But I like that point of what is it that we save? What is it that we bring, that our families brought with ourselves as we move from place to place? And I think that's pretty revelatory in each of our own cases of what our families consider to be home.
Well, your grandfather's big book, right?
Right.
The Antigua, right?
The Historia Antigua, right.
Yeah.
So what set me off on this whole thing was that a couple of years ago in this basement, of my grandparents' basement in Peekskill, I found this old binder that was stuffed with yellowing papers and old photographs falling out the sides, just labeled Historia Antigua, the ancient history. And it was 500 years of oral history of our family's stories that my grandfather was the first person to have written down. And because that shows, right? Like what he carried with him, even if it took him a while to actually write it down, were stories. And it all makes sense.
I want to go back to this binder because I think this is like a writer's dream, right? You go into the basement this is anyone's dream. This is like every Jew's dream, to go into like find this thing that says here's where we come from. But you did something that I think most people would not do or might not do, which is retrace those steps through South America, right? And try to live that life that they did.
Right, because I think that, for a long time...
So why, basically?
Why, yeah. I read the book in secret for a while because I figured that if he'd hidden it from me, like from all of us, none of us really knew about this book, there was a reason that there were maybe secrets in the book, or, he's 95, he's a doctor, and he still practices in a small office in Peekskill. But he's always a very soft-spoken person, not one that was kind of to share a story on a whim. And so this binder was always kind of just sitting there, but he never talked about it. So when I found it, I never told anybody, and I would sneak away from family gatherings to read it for a while. But then he found me out. He discovered that I was reading, and he brought me downstairs, and he said, "You've been reading my writing?" And I said, "Yes, abuelo, it's very interesting. What is this?" And he said, "What took you so long?" And then we started to actually speak in Spanish together for the first time, and to actually go over this kind of foundational text of our family, that now the stories were so much more emotional and nuanced and rich. And in it, there was this mystery that his father worked as a traveling salesman in the Andes, his father, the Syrian Jewish immigrant from Damascus, and may have left behind these long-lost children along the way. And I'm sitting there with abuelo, and we're talking about these stories in such depth. And he said, you could go look for them. And I said, "You could come with me." And he said, no. And then I went, and that kind of, I guess, speaks to my journalistic leanings, because I always have kind of looked outward in search of stories, but this was the story sitting right in front of me, and how could I not go?
And so what happens on that journey? I mean, you meet relatives, you stay with relatives, and then you sort of go off on this path that these traveling salesmen would have gone as well.
The first big realization was that many, many more Arabic-speaking Jewish immigrants to Argentina worked in this way as traveling salesmen in the Andes than I would have ever thought. I think it's super common to think that our ancestors kind of existed in these vacuums where, wow, it was only my great-grandmother who must have done this one thing. It's super unique. But the way the migrations work is that often it happens in these chains where people do things for a reason. And I'd found very quickly there was this whole kind of lost history. And so I stayed with families all along this 1,000-mile trade route who were the descendants of these traveling salespeople, but they stayed. Folk singers and shepherds and current modern-day traveling salespeople. It's pretty interesting.
And so, Elizabeth, you dig into your own family story as well. Of course, you fictionalize it, parts of it, but I'm curious how you got started on that journey and the impact it had on your family members who are still alive, and and how that affected your relationships with them.
So in a very odd way, I started this book decades ago. So I'm almost 60 this year. When I was 21, I taped my grandmother telling stories, and I've tried to remember kind of why I did it. I mean, I loved her. We were very close. I found her very confusing. She was very different from my other grandmother. She would kind of say these provocative things, like she would say, better to have been born poor than to have been born rich and lose everything. Or, what I've been through, nobody knows. And yet she was this vibrant, incredibly creative, powerful person. She'd raised 6 children. I knew that my mother, some of her siblings were half-siblings. There were just a lot of things that both compelled me and confused me. And so I did sit down with her then, and we talked for a couple hours, and I treasure those tapes. And I think I knew at the time that this was really wonderful material. I already wanted to be a writer. But I also knew that I wanted her to have the experience, and I see some of this in your book too, of my being interested in her story. Like, what does it mean to sit there, look into her eyes? The tapes are very funny, because I say at the beginning, say this is Rebecca Levy. And she's like, you want I should say my name? Like, you don't know who I am? And I'm like, no. And I'm like, it's 1985, Beverly Hills, Florida. This is where she lived, Beverly Hills, Florida. Arid little inland town in central Florida. And in her very modest house and with this big story behind her. So I got a bunch of things, she was a very good storyteller. They were dramatic. They were filled with holes, these tapes. There were many things I didn't know. Then decades passed, and I wrote a whole bunch of other books, and she would show up here and there. I wrote a poem about her. I wrote an essay about her, but it took me a really long time, and I think what led me to want to finally write the book was a sense of the next generation getting older, and myself getting older, but my mother and my uncles, and two of my uncles I spent days with interviewing their children in the book. The book moves through different points of view, so and I wanted, again, the dual thing of them both to feel that I was interested in their story and that the family would have it. So it was a deeply personal thing, but I also thought the story was fascinating and it intersected with big history in the Spanish Civil War and, the Holocaust. It's in a sort of more oblique way, but and Turkey and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, like enormous things that it took me a long time to feel confident enough to write about. So I, like Jordan, I took a lot of trips. I went to Turkey, Spain, and Cuba. I went to the house where my mom grew up in Queens and had an incredible time there with the family that lived there now, who are devout Muslims, and it was Ramadan. They welcomed us in. They shared vegetables from their garden. I told them about this Ottoman Jewish family that had lived there. So it was a long process that took many different stages. I think the other thing that led me to want to write it now, it took me almost from starting it to kind of the publication, almost a decade, but was what was happening in our current world in terms of a whole bunch of things. So immigrant, let me in and I'll make a place for myself. Children being separated from their parents at the border, anti-Semitism, other kinds of racism, and a sense of kind of the rich history and wanting to find the kind of joy and robustness and resilience in these stories while also kind of bearing witness to the suffering in a way that wasn't about what's happening now, but in my mind is in constant conversation.
And in doing so, you tell Rebecca's story, right? You trace this life that starts this very privileged, this magical childhood in Constantinople, and then of course some heartbreaking turns along the way, deeply things that happen to women along the way, right? This idea of an arranged marriage to get to a country, there was children, a lot of sort of heartbreak there. But you tell her story and you cement her legacy in this beautiful way that is so moving that when you finish it, you've done such a beautiful service to her.
Thank you. She was someone who I think felt that she had a lot of dignity, and I think she would have loved to be sitting on this stage, much more than me. I'm more comfortable at my desk, honestly. But she knew she was a creator. She was someone who in a different life would have been an artist. She loved to perform. She did community theater. So I do have this feeling, when you write about family members, it's a little tricky. You're like, would they hate it? She's not alive, so who knows, right? But I actually think, and my family has borne this out, people seem to agree with me that she would have been completely thrilled, because she really liked attention. She knew her story was important, and she also was a huge embroiderer of the truth. So the fact that I told it as fiction, she was very fluid, so I think everyone in my family has been lovely, and I think everyone, my one hesitation sometimes is that people in my family will start to think that pieces of it that I actually invented are true. And I'm like, it's fiction. Don't let it cement itself. There are a lot of other ways to think about this story, and this is just mine.
Well, I like that one day someone's going to find this in the basement and be like, someone recorded our family history.
Well, we were actually talking about that before this. We were talking about genre and how, your book is so detailed that it could read as nonfiction, and my book is nonfiction that a lot of it maybe was kind of exaggerated from family legends and all that sort of thing. It's a strange overlap. They're much closer than you would think.
Yeah.
But I have a question for you, actually, just as kind of a curious person whose grandparents are around, and I still am interviewing them and taking down details. From what we heard you read and from the whole book, which is astounding, you use such detailed lists, and I love using lists when I write, but from those tapes, do those lists come from the tapes, or were you taking notes when you were 21 also with your grandparents, or is that more of the invented stuff?
A lot of it's also research. I read a lot of books, and I went to a lot of places, and I talked to a lot of historians. So the lists are probably not straight from my grandmother, but there are whole phrases, and there's a whole section set in Adrianople when she goes. I don't want to give away too much, but she goes.
You have to buy the book after.
She goes on a very difficult journey, and that was one where she told me in such detail, and she was an extraordinarily good storyteller. So she would say things like, I said, I have actually on my website, which is elizabethgraver.com, a 5-minute video that includes clips of her voice. Which I was so glad to get to make with a little bit of help, because you can hear what a good storyteller she was. And she was very narrative, and she went into a lot of detail, but not enough detail, probably not so much with lists, but things like she would say, there was a cousin named Oro, which is a beautiful Sephardic name that means gold, right? Things that you find things that you could never make up. I mean, for you, what in the book of your grandfather ended up in your book? Is there a lot?
A lot. I mean, one of the ideas with the book and how it's structured is that I wanted to also include snippets of different things to almost recreate the spirit of the Historia Antigua that I found. So it's not just my writing, but there's clips of his writing, of my grandmother's writing, who she then a couple weeks, months after reading the Historia Antigua with Abuelo, came out with her own secret book that she never showed us for a long time.
She kept in the kitchen with the cookbooks, right?
Yeah, it was like in the like back of a recipe binder that she kept stuffed away in the cabinets, and hers was fiction. So that was interesting, right? Like my grandfather was the one who wrote these kind of broad, sweeping histories of the family's migrations, much of it likely kind of embellished and exaggerated, and my grandmother wrote fiction and what she called poems that she insisted upon reading aloud, but that are many of, I trying to get her to admit it, drawn from her real experiences growing up in Syrian Jewish neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. So this kind of blend of fact and fiction is super interesting to me. So in the book, what I try to do is I include email correspondences, Facebook group, prints and full of like, questions that I would ask about our last name, or maps and diaries and things. So a whole pastiche of different things.
I want to go back to this idea of language, because the languages change depending on where we are, right? There's a lot of languages in your book, in both of your books. And Jordan, I just want to read this quote. You say, I have vivid memories of family gatherings, of folding chairs set up around the edges of Long Island living rooms, where dozens of elderly relatives would sit, dinner plates in hand, jabbering away in the very language they wanted our family to forget. And there's this thing that happens, right, where people don't want you to speak your relatives, these grandparents, they don't want you to speak the languages they do. They want to shed a language, but then it's this sacred thing that keeps them connected to their universes.
And it's so universal, no matter where we come from, that so many of our families have this experience. Maybe that experience takes the form of the grandparents who spoke the language that they didn't want the kids to understand, because, let's see a show of hands, who had that in their family? Almost everybody in the room. And then maybe it takes the form of a language that's associated with trauma or expulsion or the reason for that migration. So then that language suddenly has all these terrible memories associated with it. That's what I'm describing in this. That language is Arabic. In my family, and this is my mother's side of the family, I do have vivid memories of when I was 5, 6, 7 years old in Nassau County, where Baghdad was kind of just transplanted to Long Island. These older relatives were speaking and telling stories and reminiscing in this rare Judeo-Baghdadi dialect of Arabic that's now slowly but surely dying out. My generation is almost surely going to be the last one to have ever heard it. It's spoken in kind of a native way. But the key there was that they didn't want us to learn it. They still don't. The people who are in my family who are alive, who speak it fluently, they're very against us learning Arabic, because they say, oh, that's the language of the past. That's the language of bad memories. Don't learn that language. And it's so common in so many families, but all I want to do is to learn that language. Because once you know the language, even pieces of it, things become so much clearer.
And that seems, cantica, that's a Ladino word for song. Right. That language unlocks so much history.
Yeah, and Ladino is a really interesting language in that even in my grandparent, they were both from that community in Turkey, even in their childhood, it was the language of the home. It was somewhat devalued, right? Their education was in French. And so my mother, who was born in Queens, just a couple years after her mother had arrived, it was her first language, but she remembers kind of traumatically being about 5 or 6 and having started school, and her father saying, "You can't call me Papa anymore, you have to call me Dad. You will never get your ears pierced," he said. And this was a time when assimilation, I mean, he had his children's interest at heart, but it was a real loss. And Ladino, there have been some, I'm sure some people in this audience know this, but there have been some extraordinary efforts to revitalize it that are going on.
Will you tell us what it is, just in case someone...
Oh, so Ladino or Judeo-Spanish is the language that formed when the Sephardic Jews were expelled from Spain. So it's a mix of pre-expulsion Castilian Spanish that kind of remained intact in its old-fashionedness. My mother once took a class in college where she was kind of trying to just float through as a gut class and pretend that she didn't have this past, and the teacher said, "Why do you speak like Cervantes?" Because she couldn't tell the difference. And then it's mixed with a lot of contact languages. So it's a fascinating language. So it has French in it. It has even some Catalan in it. It has Hebrew. It has Turkish. Depending on where it is, there's other versions of it, right? And there's Judeo-Arabic. There's Haketiya. So it's a fascinating, actually fairly new language as languages go. But it's also a language that both inside the Jewish community, where the education, for complicated reasons, there was a strong push to have it be in French, having to do with a kind of Western-leaning prejudice towards that, And then certainly in migration, it got lost, and it also was very much associated. There is kind of liturgy and things in Ladino, but mostly in its spoken form, it was kind of the language of the home and of women. So there's the incredible adages and stories and songs, but they were devalued because they were the language of home. But there is right now, there's I've done lots of really fun events around Ladino since my book came out, and there are people like Sarah Aresti who's singing it. There's Ladino Day. You can learn it online. You can take it now at SUNY Binghamton, and you can take it at the Harvard Divinity School. So there's lots of ways in which it's being revitalized. I hope that happens with Judeo-Arabic too. I don't know if it is at all.
Yeah, I'm sure you know the Oxford School of Rare Jewish Languages, which is an amazing free resource. They have Zoom classes for things like Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Greek, all sorts of rare Jewish languages, where they have linguists teaching free online Zoom classes every semester to try to revive these languages. And so I'm signed up for Judeo-Baghdadi Arabic.
Not telling your family.
Not telling my family. Well, wanting to practice with my family, honestly. Like, I'm curious, when it comes to Ladino, how many people you can practice with, because for me, that's the problem. Is like, with Spanish, I was able to immerse myself in Latin America, and now I work so much in Spanish, and it's like half my life. But with Arabic, especially this Jewish dialect, it's almost impossible to immerse yourself in it now because it's almost gone.
Yeah.
If we're talking about language, I do want to go into names, because names play a really important role in both of these books. And Jordan, I wanted you to tell us a little bit about Salim Salama and the different names he has, but also the role of nicknames, and how, depending on where you are, the way you're described is completely different.
I love the question of names, and it follows me everywhere I go, and it's kind of followed my family everywhere they've gone. So Salim Salama, my great-grandfather, this traveling salesman, he was known by all sorts of names, so much so that it became confusing for his descendants because they would name after him, but like pick the quote-unquote wrong names. So he was known as Salim in his Arabic circles, Shlomo in the synagogue, Simon or Salomon in Spanish. So then his descendants are Simon and Solomon when they're in America, or Shlomo or whatever. And one could laugh at that and just kind of brush it off and think nothing of it, but really it's about context. It's exactly about what you're saying, because when you do carry with you all of these fused hybrid identities, you become known as certain things in certain places. And sometimes you even choose different names in order to better fit in those certain places, which is really interesting. And the other thing that I love about names are last names. especially for Arab Jewish communities, what last names can reveal about the family's reputation or profession, or even a legend that's followed your family for generations. So my last name's Salama, which is like kind of like shalom, hello, goodbye, and peace, is actually accompanied by a second surname, which is Ibn Wadai. This last name, Ibn Wadai, is one that every Jewish Salama you'll meet around Latin America, the US, and the world will tell you that that is kind of accompanies the name. And some people believe it to mean son of Jews, to distinguish Christian Salamas, Muslim Salamas, and Jewish Salamas. But when I started asking around in these Facebook groups of Jews from Lebanon and Syria, there came this like crazy legend, which was that there was a woman with the last name Salama who was giving birth in Damascus many, many generations ago, and the midwife didn't arrive in time. And so her husband delivered the child. And at the Brit Milah, a week later, somebody at the party said, well, what did you do? The midwife didn't come. And she said, Huwe dae, which in Arabic, Huwe is he, and dae is midwife. He is the midwife, Huwe dae, and the last name stuck ever since. Now, who knows if that's true, but it's a really cool story that accompanies this kind of mystery last name. So I love the way that names can tell stories. And of course, that's present
And then in
County
Argentina, your grandfather has all these other, like, you have to refer to him by the nickname that he had.
Right, Moises, my grandmother calls him El Negro because of his black hair, Gordo, like just all sorts of Spanish nicknames. I call him Abuelo. He's known here as Moses, but his name is Moises. It's just like a kind of crazy mix of languages and identities.
And then Rebecca, of course, her name changes as her life goes on, right?
Her name changes as she marries several times, but there's also a moment when she is told in Spain by I made this up, but it jibed with certain things about my family. I still have some family in Barcelona. She was told you can't go about with a name that marks you as Jewish. You got to make up a different name to succeed in the workplace. So she calls herself Blanco for a while. And it is in fact true that my relatives in Spain adopted names that didn't show them as Jewish, the ones who stayed. So yeah, so I'm really interested in both how names can reveal and how they can be used to pass or hide. You know, as I'm sure some people here know, in Sephardic culture, you name children after living relatives, starting with like the male grandfather, and there's a whole system which is totally different from Ashkenazi. So my parents,
I know there's gasps in
my
the audience
parents
right
were
now.
a little. My
You do
parents had
what?
a hard time with this because they wanted to name my sister Lauren, and my father's name was Lawrence. My mother did, and my father's side was like, you cannot do that. So they gave it to her as her middle name. But so the ways for me, in some ways, the names were both things that could be changed and kind of deployed to hide or shift identity, but also there's an enormous amount of passing down of names. And I also made a decision in my novel, which is pretty unconventional, I had never done it before, to use real names for the characters based on real family. And I got permission from the ones who were still living. And I said to my mom and my Uncle David and my Uncle Albert, if you want me to change your names, I'll do whatever you want. And they were all like, nope, use my real name. So that was wonderful, but it signals differently to me because those are real people.
I know we're collecting questions from the audience, so if you have any, write them down, and we'll get to them very soon. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of Jewish stories. You mentioned gefilte fish earlier. The Jewish stories that we hear are primarily those that come from Eastern Europe, right? These stories of going back to find family. You know, it's only there's a reason we're sort of here talking about, you know, this idea of the wandering Jew that takes a different route. And so I guess I wanted to ask you if that was part of your reasoning for writing these stories, of sort of giving voice to these Mizrachi, these Sephardic narratives, and if there were other examples along the way that you saw of similar stories.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think definitely my answer is yes, and I would imagine maybe it's similar in your case. But for me, I think that there were just kind of a confluence of factors where growing up in Westchester, where there are not a lot of Sephardic Jews, not as many for sure, and not hearing these stories as often, I always felt very different. And especially when reading books about Jewish history, I felt like my stories weren't necessarily always reflected. There were very few books that reflected for a kind of general audience the stories that I was so familiar with my family. And so
Of
you
the
asked,
Arabic gauchos.
right, of Arabic speaking gauchos, like crazy. But no, but also like just Iraqi Jews and Syrian Jews, like in a secular context where they're leaning into the languages that they speak and all the legends and stories that are passed down. It was just not something that I saw that much. And so I think that's what made me want to become a writer, because in a large part, like you, I just wanted to record these stories so that somebody would remember them when we weren't around anymore to tell them. And so that's a big driver of why I wrote this book, because I kind of wanted it to be on the shelf. The Historia Antigua was on the shelf. Like, that was the first time that I saw this so vividly reflected. But I wanted our story to be on the shelves of Jewish literature so that other kids like me could read that kind of a book.
Yeah, I absolutely. You know, I think the more Judaism, like all other cultures, it's extraordinarily complex and varied, and it's taken many, many different forms, and there's worth and beauty in all of the stories. And the fact that, for me, Ladino is endangered and vanishing. There was a sense both, you know, when I talked earlier about some of the people who were involved in these stories are getting older or have already passed on, and also the cultures. I mean, even the places that I visited and wrote about in the book, the amount that Turkey has changed since 1907, and even since the first time I went there when I was 30, and the amount that Cuba has changed. So I do think, I mean, on the one hand, you get this feeling of like things are just going to keep cycling and changing, and, you know, la plus ça change, as the French say. But on the other hand, I did have a desire there was something fugitive about it all. There was a sense of these very valuable things that hadn't been written about that much. And I found some wonderful writers, but not much fiction. There's very little Sephardic fiction. But, you know, some of you probably know, I know he was, he won a Jewish Book Award last year, but Michael Frank wrote this gorgeous book called 100 Saturdays. We've done a few events together. That's the story of Stella Levy from Rhodes. I've discovered some amazing historians, someone named Sarah Abravaya Stein.
Family Papers.
Yeah, who I think also won a Jewish Book Award. And you know, there's 2 Netflix series. There's the Beauty Queen of Jerusalem, which has Ladino in it. There's another one that I liked even more called The Club, set in Turkey, Kulüp, that's about Istanbul in the 1950s and has Ladino. And my relatives, I have a couple relatives who were born in Turkey who still speak Ladino natively, and they said it's incredibly well done. So I've discovered these worlds, but there's really not that much, you know. And the more the merrier. Like I hope people will keep. There's a Sephardic writing contest that I am one of the judges for. The deadline is really soon. And it's through the Sephardic Federation, and there's a category for students who are 18 and up, and then for adults. And that was really an effort by a historian called Devin Narr at the University of Washington and some other people to reach out and invite people. The same way that your grandfather made that incredible book. I taped my grandmother, like everybody, whether they're Sephardic or Mizrahi or Ashkenazi or not Jewish, these are stories, like they're so valuable. So I do, but if that is a world you're interested in, look up that contest and start writing really fast.
Start typing now. And it's so beautiful because these books continue these rich traditions of storytelling in both of your families. And Jordan, before we go to questions, I just want to read this because I think it's just beautiful. You write, the act of telling these stories from one generation to the next helped reinforce the idea that we were part of something larger than ourselves, that we had an identity that was worth preserving. And I just want to, I'm just reading your book to you now.
Thank you.
Okay. Someone wants to know, Elizabeth, what the book title means.
Oh, I'm sorry, I should have said that. It means song. Cantita.
In what language?
In Ladino.
That's one of the things I love the most about your book too, is that speaking Spanish, it's so amazing to read the Ladino and then like almost try to predict what the translation is afterwards.
You can get pretty far.
You know what happened to me? I was reporting a unrelated to Judaism story in Bosnia, and I went to a Shabbat service on Friday night, and the people there only spoke Bosnian and Ladino, and I only spoke English and Spanish, and we actually had a conversation, them speaking Ladino and me speaking in Spanish, and it was amazing.
If language is so essential in passing along culture and stories, how does the young assimilated generation learn their history and their stories?
I mean, I think some of it is that hopefully in a book like the one I wrote or the one Jordan wrote, there's translation, there's context, that you're actually making it accessible. You know, I love how the design of my book has this little portal, and it has this word that many people won't understand. Well, you can see it behind me much better. But I don't write to obfuscate. I mean, I think the idea is to kind of invite people in through storytelling, through language, through tactile kind of a sense of worldness, and that once you're there, you know, I have a 23-year-old daughter, and after she read my book, she wrote me, of course it was a text, she wrote me a very beautiful text saying, she was I'm kind of floored by thinking about how different this life of my great-grandmother was, and also how close in time it was to me. And I think that, to me, of course it was my daughter, so that was incredibly moving, but that sense that on the one hand this is history, and on the other hand it's really not very far away. And we are all, I love all your questions, but that question about home, my daughter is made up of those stories too. So I don't think you need to speak all the languages, or we're both pretty obsessive, I think, in terms of, you don't need to go to these lengths, although it's really fun if you want to. But I think that's what some of these stories can just invite people in and let them kind of float through it without having to be experts.
But I also think it's about asking the questions before, for a young assimilated, speaking as the young assimilated generation, I think that it's, I think that it's about asking questions before it's too late. If you have the chance to speak with your grandparents, to speak with your parents, to record these stories like you did, like I am still doing, and that we are all still doing in many ways, because there are, even if the people are gone, to ask questions of the texts that we find, or the kind of family troves of history, it's such an important exercise because it helps us understand ourselves in profound ways.
And if you are one of the grandparents, tell your story. You know, don't assume that people wouldn't be interested.
Don't hide the book.
Don't hide the book, yeah.
I have two personal questions for each of you. Jordan, what did your grandfather think of your book?
He said, muy bien. No, he really appreciated it. I think that it was a process that, it wasn't like he just read it at the end and that was it. It was a very collaborative process where I would constantly be providing him with updates, and this book took many forms. So he was part of the writing all along the way, which is really cool. And he was at the book launch in New York a couple weeks ago, which was amazing. And it's cool, yeah, I think that he thinks it's cool to see that people are reading his story. Abuela too, though she's a little bit more camera shy than he is.
And then, Elizabeth, we have a question. This is not a question, this is just my late husband's mom was also Rebecca Levy from Turkey. Oh. She was from a town called Shorlu, I'm saying that wrong, and the Levy descendants from there.
Oh my goodness.
Are you related?
You know, Rebecca and Levy, it's kind of like, I hope so. Maybe.
So I guess I want to end us. This is an amazing conversation. It's such a privilege to be speaking with both of you. I want you to leave us with sort of something that you learned from your journeys that you keep with you, that we could all sort of take with us as we navigate our own stories and learn about our lives and continue to live our lives.
I think that this happened to me, and I think that in speaking with communities now in different places about family stories and the process of kind of rediscovering and reimagining our family's past, it's that you're not alone in this. It's, I think, very easy to feel like we're the only ones in this situation, that my family's the only way, that this was, we were talking about it before, about like existing in a vacuum. But even in the process of doing this, it could be a very lonely process to feel like you're not part of something, and to feel like you're kind of on this singularly difficult journey to rediscover. But the truth is, if you look hard and far enough, you will find other people who are on that same path. And when you do, it's like a big kind of sigh of relief. it almost feels like a warm hug. Like I talk a lot about entering into these families' homes in Argentina and finding these familiar traces of identity and feeling suddenly so much more comfortable, like I'm understood, like I'm not the only one anymore. Like that was why it was so important for me to go, because where I grew up, we were the only ones that were like us, but then suddenly I was surrounded by Spanish-speaking Jews. I was surrounded by people who had these histories, and it felt so good. And life just feels better when you know. So I encourage everybody to try it.
That's lovely. I would say, I guess, two things. One is somewhat similar, which is that if you ask, people will tell, that people like to tell their stories. I actually had an incredible experience today. I'm now poking around in my father's side, and I went to the South Bronx today with my nephew, and I had from old censuses several addresses of where my grandfather on that side, whom I never met, and my father, who's no longer alive, lived. And we talked to people on the street, and the mail. I was with my 24-year-old nephew, and at one place we were peeking in. I'm like, I want to go inside. I want to go inside. And the mailman came, and I was like, do you think maybe we could like go inside? You know, when you open the door to the, he said, of course, you know. And so then we're poking around. So like you have a lot of adventures, and then we started to talk to him about his story, and you know, that this neighborhood used to be almost all Jewish. Now it's almost all black. Like the different ways in which the waves of people who've lived there and the lives they've built. And he was this lovely, interesting man. So I guess somehow and I felt this with other books too, but even more with this one, everybody has a story, and they're often really happy to share them. And I guess the one other thing I would just very quickly say is that reading over and over and imagining and researching, particularly women's lives through Rebecca, I had a very strong sense of kind of that I hadn't ever worked through in my mind so much or felt so viscerally of her resilience. And through many, many, many different changes, finding creativity in different ways, losing one thing and making it into something else, not writing a book. She didn't do that. She wouldn't have wanted to do that. She wasn't literary, but extraordinary creativity that was really moving and made me feel like I'm making one thing, but her life was just filled with making in all these other ways, and that was really inspiring.
That's amazing. Jordan, Elizabeth, thank you so much. Books are right there. Signing is right there. Thank you to the Jewish Museum and to the Jewish Book Council. And we'll be back here next month.
Thank you.
Thanks, that was fun.